On most mornings, Highway 47 in Red Mesa County is just another line on the map. 2 lanes of faded asphalt, a few pickups, a school bus, a couple of commuters trying not to spill their coffee as they head into town. It's the kind of road you stop noticing after a while. You drive it, you get where you're going, and you forget it exists. But on this particular morning, the road refused to be invisible. Traffic came to a full stop in both directions. At first, people thought it was a construction or maybe an accident around the next bend. Engines idled. The radio played low. One by one, drivers stepped out of their cars to see what was going on. Then, they saw her. In the very center of Highway 47, right on the cracked yellow line, a female bobcat was sitting as if she owned the place. No running, no darting, no frantic pacing, just sitting, upright, still. Behind her, a small pickup had stopped so quickly, the front bumper nearly kissed the center line. Behind that, a line of trucks and sedans stretched out toward the desert. For a long moment, nobody moved. There's a particular kind of silence that falls when grown adults are suddenly unsure of the rules. This wasn't a zoo. It wasn't a nature documentary. This was out where the desert brush scraped the sky, and a wild bobcat had decided the highway was hers for the day. A woman in blue hospital scrubs shaded her eyes with one hand and whispered, "You've got to be kidding me." A long-haul driver leaned out of his cab, cell phone in hand, caught between recording and simply watching. Even a rancher in a dusty hat, the kind of man who'd seen just about everything the desert could throw at him, stood there on the shoulder, lips pressed together, not saying a word. At first, it looked like one animal, one problem, a simple traffic hazard. But then someone closer to the front sucked in a breath and pointed. "There's more. Look." At her feet. Tiny shapes, almost the same color as the road, began to move. 1, 2, 3, 4. Bobcat kittens, so small they barely cleared the height of the painted line, were pressed against their mother's legs. 2 of them batted clumsily at the stripes. The other 2 barely moved at all. If you were there that morning, you might have felt something shift in your chest. It's hard to stay annoyed about being late for work when you're watching a wild family stand between you and the rest of your day. Someone finally did what people do in every corner of the United States when something strange happens on the road. They called the police. The cruiser that responded didn't come roaring in with sirens wailing. It rolled up the shoulder with a kind of tired familiarity, as if it had done this run 1,000 times. On duty that morning was Officer Caleb Morgan, a man in his mid-50s who knew every crack and curve of Highway 47 by heart. From a distance, all he saw were hazard lights and a small crowd bunched near the front of the line. It wasn't until he stepped out, the heat already pushing up from the asphalt, that he noticed how oddly still people were standing. Not angry, not swarming, just frozen. "All right, folks," he called out, trying to keep it practical. "Let's give her some space." The crowd shifted, reluctantly clearing a path. Caleb walked right up the center of the road, his boots scuffing the dust, every eye following him. As he stepped past the last truck, he finally saw what had stopped a highway full of adults in their tracks. Not just a bobcat, a mother. 4 kittens huddled in a loose circle around her paws. 2 bright and busy, 2 the color of worry. In that moment, the scene stopped being funny, or curious, or something to upload later. It became very, very real. Most of us have had a day interrupted by something we didn't plan for. A phone call, a diagnosis, a sudden change in weather. But an entire line of strangers rarely gets interrupted together, all of them forced to look at the same thing and quietly decide what kind of people they're going to be. Do we honk and shout? Do we push forward? Or do we stand there, hands on our hips, coffee cooling in the cup holder, and allow a wild animal to have the right of way, just this once? For the people on Highway 47 that morning, the interruption became a kind of mirror. Some were frightened, some frustrated, some unexpectedly moved. One nurse later said that watching that mother bobcat hold her ground felt uncomfortably familiar, like standing between her patients and the chaos of a busy emergency room. What none of them knew yet was that this was only the beginning. The real story, the part that would stay with Officer Caleb long after the traffic cleared, wasn't just that a bobcat family stopped the highway. It was what that mother was asking for. It would take time and 2 trips to a small wildlife center for anyone to fully understand just how far she was willing to bend her instincts and how much trust she was willing to place in the very species that built the road beneath her paws. Before we can really appreciate what happened out there, the decisions Caleb made, the risk the mother took, and the quiet agreement that formed between them, we need to know who he was before that morning. What kind of man steps out of his cruiser, sees a bobcat blocking traffic, and walks forward anyway? That's where we're headed next. If stories like this speak to something in you, that part that still believes there's room on our roads and in our lives for the wild, stay with me. In the next part, we'll step off the highway and into Caleb Morgan's world, just before a bobcat family changed it. Before the bobcat family ever stepped onto Highway 47, Officer Caleb Morgan's life moved in straight lines. Every morning started the same way. The old coffee maker sputtered on the counter, the metal thermos filling, steam curling up and fogging his glasses for a second. The quiet of a house that had gotten used to 1 chair pulled out at the table instead of 2. Keys on the hook by the door. The familiar weight of the duty belt. Nothing dramatic, just habit. Out in Red Mesa County, routine can feel like safety. Caleb had been on patrol for more than 30 years. He'd seen the town grow a little, seen the traffic pick up, watched that strip of road turn from cracked blacktop into an artery for trucks and commuters. Somewhere along the way, his work shifted from what might happen today to let's get through this shift without anything happening at all. He still did his job well. He knew which curve on Highway 47 tended to hide a stalled car. He knew which rancher's cattle liked to crowd the fence. He knew how the desert heat would shimmer on the hood of his cruiser by 10 in the morning. It was all familiar, like an old song you can hum without thinking. If you had walked into the small office at the sheriff's substation, you'd have seen Caleb's corner. A desk that had seen better days. A stack of old commendations pushed off to the side, the edges curling. Tucked into the frame of the computer screen, a faded photo showed a younger version of him standing beside a rescued deer, one hand outstretched, palm open. Behind him, a spilled box of cones from a long-ago traffic stop nobody talks about anymore. He didn't take that photo down. He just stopped really seeing it. On the wall, a newer bulletin listed wildlife incidents in dry black print. Snakes on porches, elk in the road, the occasional call about a bobcat crossing too close to a neighborhood. Just items on a list. Clear it, log it, move on. In truth, there was a time when those calls were his favorite. When he was fresh out of the academy, getting to help a stunned hawk or a coyote hit by a car felt like proof that his badge could do more than write tickets. But years wear grooves into a person. You go from rescues to reports, from stories you tell at dinner to stories you file and forget. Still, small cracks in the routine had started to show. Some evenings, when the day was finally done, Caleb would drive home with the sun low over the desert. The light at that hour felt softer, less like a command and more like an invitation. He'd park in the same spot, step out, and just stand for a moment beside the car, listening to the wind push through dry grass. Every once in a while, on those drives, a shadow would slip across the road ahead of him. A bobcat or maybe a coyote gliding from one side of the highway to the other, like the asphalt wasn't even there. By the time he reached the spot, it would be gone, swallowed by creosote and sage. He would scan the brush, see nothing, and keep going. There's a certain ache that settles in when you start to feel like the big, meaningful moments are behind you. Caleb never said that out loud, but you could hear it in the way he talked about kids on the force now and letting the younger guys handle the excitement. You could see it in the way his thermos came home still half full, because nothing that day had been big enough to make him forget the coffee. Maybe you know that feeling. You do your job, you meet your responsibilities, you keep things running. People lean on you because you are steady. But deep down, there's a quiet question. Is there still something new for me? Some part of me I haven't used up yet? For Caleb, that unused part had always been the side of him that cared about wild things. As a boy, he'd sit up late, watching nature shows, fascinated by mountain lions and bobcats slipping through the dark. As an officer, he'd learned the practical side, how to keep people safe, how to call wildlife officers, how to clear a road without anyone getting hurt. Somewhere between those two versions of himself, a gap had opened. He didn't think much about that gap, until the morning his radio crackled and turned an ordinary patrol into something else. He was halfway through his first cup of coffee, the harsh desert sun already glaring against the windshield, when dispatch called out the code. Traffic backed up on Highway 47, some kind of large animal in the road. At first, he pictured a cow out of a broken fence, or a mule deer frozen in headlights. Another hazard, another box to check. But the dispatcher's voice had a different tone when she added, "Caller says it might be a bobcat, and it's not moving." He glanced at his still full thermos in the cup holder. For the first time in a while, his heart rate ticked up a notch. Not with fear, with something closer to curiosity, or maybe recognition. He turned the cruiser toward the highway. In that moment, he had no way of knowing that this animal in the road would press right into that unused place in him, that a bobcat mother and her kittens would ask him, without a single word, to be more than a man who wrote reports and kept cars moving. He just knew that a line of people was stopped on his road, waiting for him to decide what happened next. If you've ever wondered whether there's still a turning point hiding somewhere in the middle of a very ordinary life, this is where Caleb's story begins. In the next part, we'll drive back out to Highway 47 with him and stand at the place where his routine ended, and a wild, unexpected calling stepped into his path, wearing spotted fur and standing on a yellow line. By the time Caleb eased his cruiser onto the shoulder of Highway 47, the road looked less like a highway and more like a paused movie. Engines idled, doors hung open. People stood in the dusty space between bumpers, looking toward the front of the line, as if a single scene up there was holding all of them in place. Caleb stepped out, shut his door, and for a brief second just listened. He expected the usual sounds of frustration, horns, raised voices, somebody shouting about being late. Instead, he heard something else. Quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of an empty desert morning, but a tight, held breath kind of silence. The kind that falls when no one is quite sure what they're looking at. He walked up the center line, one measured step at a time. A man in a ball cap gave a small nod as he passed. The nurse in blue scrubs who had been on her way to the hospital stood with her arms folded, coffee cooling in her hand, eyes fixed straight ahead. "Morning," Caleb murmured as he moved past them. "Let's all stay back, all right?" And then he saw what they were seeing. Right on the faded double yellow, a female bobcat sat in the middle of the lane. The desert stretched out on both sides, open, wild, full of places she could have been. But she chose here. The worst possible place in human eyes. The most visible place is hers. She wasn't pacing or baring her teeth. She wasn't fleeing to the shoulder the way most wild animals do when faced with a wall of metal and noise. She sat upright, shoulders relaxed, tail tucked neatly, as if this strip of paint, this human line, was where she had decided to make a stand. At first, Caleb thought she was alone. Then the road moved. 4 small shapes shifted against the gray and yellow. Bobcat kittens, their spotted coats blending with the broken patches of light and shadow on the asphalt. 2 of them were full of that wild, unsteady energy you see in young animals, swatting at the paint, tripping over each other, batting at their mother's tail. The other 2 looked like ghosts, trying to keep up with the living. They were half the size of their siblings, for dull, not glossy. Heads low. One tried to climb over a crack in the pavement and almost didn't make it. The heat from the road pressed up around them like a second sky. Caleb's training kicked in first. He took in the distance to the ditch, the escape routes, the angle of the cars, and the way the mother's ears tracked his footsteps. He knew closing on a mother bobcat with kittens was not something they ever recommended in any manual. But manuals also didn't cover what to do when a kitten's legs suddenly buckled. It happened fast. One of the small ones took a step, wobbled, and then collapsed straight down. like the strings had been cut. No stumble, no scramble, just down. Its sides heaved against the heat-soaked pavement in short, sharp breaths. A murmur washed through the group of drivers behind Caleb. Someone whispered, "Oh no." Someone else reached for their phone, then thought better of it and just watched. The mother bobcat did not run. She could have. The scrub was only a dozen yards away. One leap, two, and she would vanish into the brush with her 3 remaining kittens, leaving the struggling runt to its fate on the yellow line. That's what we're taught to expect from nature. Harsh, unsentimental. Let the weak go so the strong can survive. But she didn't. Instead, she looked at the collapsed kitten. Then she looked at Caleb. It was not a soft look, not pleading, not grateful. It was steady and unblinking, the way only a wild animal can stare. A measuring look. If you've ever stood in a doorway during a family crisis, weighing choices you never wanted, you might recognize something of that look. Not in the details, but in the weight of it. Caleb felt the air tighten in his chest. He tapped his radio, keeping his voice low. "Dispatch, this is Morgan. I've got a bobcat with 4 young in the middle of 47. One's down. I'm going to need wildlife support and probably the rescue center on standby." Static. Then the dispatcher's calm reply. "Copy that, Morgan. Desert Ridge Wildlife is on call. Advise when you're clear." Clear. He wasn't sure what clear even meant in this moment. He took a slow step forward, then another. The mother's muscles bunched just slightly, a warning, not yet. Caleb lifted his hands a little, palms out. He talked the way he would to someone on a front porch who was already halfway to slamming the door. "You're all right," he said quietly. "I see them. I'm not here for you. I'm here for the little one, that's all." The bobcat glanced back down at the tiny form on the line. Then something remarkable happened. She stood. She moved 3 precise steps backward, away from the runt, never taking her eyes off Caleb. Her other kittens clustered around her legs, confused and restless. The small, broken body on the yellow stripe was suddenly alone in the space between them. She had just made a choice. In the wild, a mother bobcat's options are brutally simple. Spread thin and risk all of them, or pour what she has into the strongest. But here she was, on a man-made road, adding a third option into her impossible math. Risk everything, once more, and see if the 2-legged creatures in uniforms might carry what she no longer could. Caleb knelt, feeling the heat of the asphalt through his knees. He didn't reach straight for the kitten. Instead, he set an old blanket on the road beside it, moving slowly enough that the air seemed to hold its breath with him. The kitten was shockingly light when he finally scooped it up, more air than fur. It let out the faintest hiss, a dry, brittle sound that still carried a spark of fight. "I know," he whispered, wrapping it gently. "You're big. You're in trouble. You've got a lot to do." Behind him, nobody cheered. Nobody clapped. A highway full of people simply watched a man in a uniform lift a tiny bobcat off a line they all crossed without thinking, every day. Most of us will never face a moment like that, on the yellow paint of a desert road, but we do face smaller versions of it all the time. Those quiet pauses where we can either look away or move closer to something fragile that might not survive without help. As Caleb backed slowly toward his cruiser, the mother bobcat stayed where she was, standing guard over the 3 remaining kittens. She didn't threaten, she didn't retreat. She just watched, as if memorizing the sight of her smallest being carried off. In a few minutes, Caleb would be on the radio to Desert Ridge Wildlife Rescue. In less than an hour, that tiny life would be on a stainless steel table under fluorescent lights, fighting odds that no one could quite calculate. And this standoff on Highway 47, this quiet negotiation between one mother and one officer, would become the hinge that swung all of their lives in a new direction. In the next part, we'll step through the doors of that small wildlife center and see what happens when a wild animal's last gamble arrives wrapped in a blanket. If you've ever wondered what goes on behind the scenes when someone rescues a bobcat from a road like this, stay with me. That's where we're headed next. If the highway was all glare and noise, Desert Ridge Wildlife Center felt like someone had turned the volume down on the world. When Caleb pushed through the glass door with that bundled bobcat kitten in his arms, the first thing that hit him wasn't the smell of antiseptic. It was quiet. Not empty. Quiet. Working quietly. The kind you hear in a place where everyone knows there's not much room for mistakes. A bell over the door gave a soft ring. Somewhere down the hall, a parrot muttered. A phone rang once, then stopped. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their reflection catching for a second on the kitten's limp whiskers. A woman from the back called out, "Bobcat?" And before Caleb could even answer, she was there, hands already reaching for the blanket. This is where the story pulls in a little closer. The examination room was small. Stainless steel table, scale in the corner. A whiteboard with names and weights written in different colors. Hawk, jackrabbit, fox, 2 unnamed bobcats with question marks by their projected release dates. This is where wild lives got translated into numbers and plans. Caleb laid the bundle down as gently as he could. The kitten looked even smaller under the harsh lights than it had on the road. The desert dust on its fur was now just a sad, dull film. "Doctor." Eleanor Park spoke softly as she worked. Not because the kitten could understand her, but because it seemed wrong to break the hush. "Nail," she said after a quick check. "Very underweight. We're going to move fast." She moved with that practiced efficiency you see in people who have done a hard thing too many times. Thermometer, stethoscope, tiny needle sliding under paper-thin skin to start fluids. The numbers came out in calm, clipped phrases. Heart rate, blood sugar, temperature. She explained just enough for Caleb to track it. "A bobcat this age," she said, adjusting the flow on the IV, "should weigh at least 2 or 3 pounds. He's barely a fraction of that. Severe dehydration, likely hypoglycemic. His mother's probably been struggling for a while." She paused long enough to look up at Caleb. "You did the right thing getting him here quickly," she added. "But this is going to be a close one." That's the straightforward truth behind a lot of wildlife rescues. By the time an animal is sick enough or weak enough for us to notice, the margin is already razor thin. While she worked, the camera of our attention steps back a little, just enough to show where this place fits into the larger picture. Desert Ridge isn't a big facility. It's some outdoor enclosures, a quarantine room, a small staff doing more than their share. Places that quietly catch the fallout of our roads, our fences, our windows, our poisons. Bobcats, especially in the Southwest, live in the spaces we leave between all of that. They hunt rodents in the washes, slip along fence lines, and cross highways at night when they think it's safe. They play an important role most people never see, keeping rodent populations in check, balancing the smaller predators we don't always think about. When a bobcat goes down on a road like 47, you're not just losing one animal. You're tugging at a thread in the whole fabric. Elena finished her immediate checks and motioned for a tech to help move the kitten into an incubator. A clear plastic box with warm air and a soft towel. Wires and tubes looked oversized against his tiny body. "Heat, fluids, glucose support," she said, mostly to herself. "Then we see if he wants to stay." It's a simple sentence that carries a lot more weight in this line of work than it does anywhere else. As the day wore on, Desert Ridge slipped into its usual rhythm around this new arrival. A volunteer cleaned cages. Someone weighed a red-tailed hawk who had finally started to eat again. The phone buzzed with a call about a raccoon and a culvert. Life didn't stop for one bobcat, but you could feel the center tilting just a little toward that incubator. Caleb found himself standing at the glass more than once. He watched the rise and fall of that small chest, the way a paw twitched now and then. The kitten was hooked up to more equipment than seemed possible for something so small. "Don't get too attached," Elena said quietly, joining him for a moment. There wasn't any coldness in her voice, just a tired honesty. "We fight hard. Sometimes it's enough. Sometimes it isn't." She nodded toward the whiteboard. "You see those check marks by the names?" Those are the ones who made it to release. We don't write the others up there. Doesn't mean they didn't matter." He glanced at her, surprised by how gently she said it. "If we're doing this right," she continued, "most of them never remember us at all. They grow, they hiss at us, they leave. We're just a bridge they cross in the dark." Saving the wild, in places like this, is mostly about letting go. You pick up something broken, you pour your time and heart into it, and then, if everything goes well, you step aside and watch it disappear back into a life that has no place for you in it. For a man whose job had been about control and presence for so long, lights, sirens, reports, showing up, that idea unexpectedly settled into Caleb. He wasn't sure yet what it meant. He just knew that he didn't want the tiny body in that box to become one of the unnamed ones. Before he left, Elena scribbled a number on a small card and handed it to him. "We'll call with updates," she said. "But if you're out on 47 again, keep an eye out." If there's the thought of that mother bobcat still out there by the highway, doing her own calculations in the scrub, followed him all the way back to his cruiser. As he the highway in the next part, we'll ride along with Caleb through the days that followed. The patrols passed that same mile marker, the nagging sense that something had been left unfinished, and the eerie feeling of being watched by eyes he couldn't see. If you've ever had a moment you couldn't shake, even when life told you to move on, stay with me. That's where the story turns next. The morning after the rescue, Highway 47 looked exactly the way it always had, and nothing about it felt the same. Caleb had been on that road more times than he could count. He knew every dip where rain liked to pool, every mile marker, every faded billboard. But now, as he steered the cruiser into his usual patrol, his eyes kept drifting to one particular stretch of asphalt, the place where a mother bobcat had stood her ground on the yellow line and handed him her smallest kitten. He told himself he was just doing his job, checking for debris, watching speed, making sure there weren't any new hazards. But if you had been riding shotgun those next 3 days, you would have seen it. The way his shoulders shifted when the mile markers crept up toward that spot. The way his hand eased off the wheel. The way his foot lifted just slightly from the gas. On the first day, the desert wore its usual face. The sun is already high, light bouncing hard off the road. When he reached the bend, where traffic had frozen the day before, he slowed without really deciding to. The shoulders were clear. No cars, no people, just the long, empty ribbon of Highway 47 stretching into the haze. Still, he drifted onto the gravel, rolled to a stop, and sat there for a moment with the engine ticking. From inside the cruiser, the tree line looked close enough to touch, but beyond that thin fringe of mesquite and juniper, the land folded and dropped into washes and rocky gullies. Plenty of places for a bobcat family to vanish. He lowered the window and listened. Nothing. No horns, no voices, just a faint rattle of dry leaves and the whisper of a light breeze hitting the side of the car. Somewhere, far off, a truck downshifted. That was it. It's a strange thing to listen to something you've never really listened to before. Caleb had always been aware of wildlife on the highway. Deer in headlights, a coyote slipping across at dusk, a bobcat just a shadow on the shoulder. But this was different. He wasn't scanning for a hazard. He was hoping. Maybe, he thought, that little male was fighting for air under the warm lights at Desert Ridge Wildlife Center. Maybe his mother had taken the other 3 bobcat kittens back into the scrub and found better hunting. Maybe, just maybe, she'd never have to step onto this road again. He knew better than to bank on maybe, but it's hard to turn that part of the mind off. The second day, clouds rolled in early. A thin sheet of rain turned the blacktop darker, pulled the smell of wet dust up into the air. The wipers thumped in a slow rhythm as he approached that same stretch of Highway 47. Again, he pulled over. This time, he got out, boots sinking slightly into the soft shoulder. He walked up to the spot where he remembered kneeling with the blanket in his hand. The water had washed away any tracks, no paw prints. No sign that a bobcat family had ever been there. He stood facing the tree line, rain settling on his uniform, and stared into the brush. It's funny how your imagination fills in what your eyes can't see. He pictured the mother bobcat, ribs showing a little more now, slipping between the shrubs. He pictured the two bigger kittens wrestling under a low branch, unaware of the math their mother was still doing on their behalf. And he pictured the fourth, the one they hadn't found, somewhere between hanging on and letting go. He thought about walking in, just a few yards, just to look, to make sure there wasn't a small body lying too close to the road, waiting for scavengers and trucks. He took a step toward the brush and stopped. This land wasn't his, the way the asphalt was. Out here, his training could turn into trouble. He knew enough to understand that tromping through the scrub might spook a weakened animal, break up a bobcat family's fragile routines, leave his scent where it didn't belong. He stood there, hands on his hips, feeling the pull in both directions, toward action and toward restraint. In the end, he chose to do the harder thing for a man whose job is usually to move forward. He did nothing. He let the silence and the tree line keep their secrets. On the third day, the desert changed costumes again. A low morning fog hugged the ground, softening the edges of everything. Highway 47, usually sharp and hard, looked almost kind. Caleb flicked off the radio for a few miles and drove in that quiet pocket, the mist blurring the distance. When the turnoff came into view, he didn't pull over this time. He slowed, that was all. The place where the bobcat had blocked traffic appeared and passed in a handful of seconds. From the outside, it might have looked like he was finally letting it go. On the inside, something different was happening. He couldn't stop thinking about that mother bobcat's choice, how she'd risked the lives of all four kittens by stepping onto the highway in broad daylight, how she'd stepped back and left her smallest child in the no man's land between herself and a human stranger, trusting that he would do something she could not. Most of the time, we hear about wild animals in terms of instinct, a list of automatic behaviors handed down by nature. But if you watched her on that road, the way she weighed her options, the way she blocked a stream of vehicles to force help to arrive, it didn't feel automatic. It felt considered. And for a man who had spent decades responding to calls, filling out forms, following procedure, that realization landed hard. A bobcat from the hills had improvised more courage in 20 minutes than he'd asked of himself in years. Back at home in the evenings, the thermos on the counter stayed full longer than usual. He'd catch himself standing in the kitchen, the TV murmuring in the other room, thinking not about the day's reports, but about a clear plastic incubator in a small wildlife center and a fragile chest, rising and falling under wires. He called Desert Ridge when he could, always bracing a little for the worst. "Still with us," they'd say. "Touch and go, we'll let you know." It wasn't reassurance, exactly, but it was enough to keep him driving past that mile marker just a little slower. If you've ever had something you witnessed stay with you long after everyone else has moved on, an expression, a moment on a hospital bed, a conversation in a doorway, you know what these 3 days felt like. Life keeps asking for your attention, but part of you is parked on the shoulder of a particular memory, watching a silent tree line. On the morning of the fourth day, as the radio crackled to life with a call that sounded eerily familiar, traffic stopped on Highway 47, a large cat in the road again. Caleb understood that some stories don't end the first time you drive away. Sometimes they circle back. In the next part, we'll go with him to that second scene on the yellow line, where the shocking truth of what this mother bobcat was really doing finally steps into focus. If you want to see how far a wild animal will go to give her young a chance, and what that demanded from the humans watching, stay with me. That's where we're headed next. On the fourth morning, the call came in with the same dry language it always used for emergencies. "Unit 3, we've got a traffic hazard on Highway 47, eastbound. Reports of a large cat in the road. Vehicles stopped in both directions." A traffic hazard. Sitting in his cruiser, coffee untouched, Caleb felt his heartbeat do something his training never taught it to do. Before dispatch even finished the sentence, he knew exactly which mile marker they were talking about. He turned the wheel toward the highway without saying much. Some things you don't need to discuss on the radio. By the time he reached that familiar bend, the scene looked like a strange replay of the first day. Cars angled on the shoulder, trucks idling. People got out of their vehicles, but this time, they weren't shouting or waving their arms. They were waiting. Caleb eased onto the gravel and stepped out. The air was cooler than it had been 3 days earlier, but the light was just as bright. A woman in scrubs recognized him and gave a small, tight nod. A long-haul trucker who had filmed the first standoff stood with his phone in his hand again, but it hung at his side, unused. No one seemed eager to break the spell. "Same deal as before," someone murmured. "She's back." Caleb walked up the center of Highway 47. Boots tracing the same faded yellow lines where he'd knelt with a blanket. Each step felt like walking into a memory that hadn't finished writing itself. And then he saw her. The mother bobcat sat in nearly the same spot as before, right on the paint. The desert stretched around her, full of escape routes and hideouts. But once again she chose the most exposed place available, the middle of a human road. This time, there were only 3 bobcat kittens. 2 of them were the same sturdy, restless bodies he remembered, now bolder, wrestling near the edge of the lane. The third lay flat on the stripe itself, legs splayed, chin on the pavement, not moving at all. From where he stood, Caleb could see the faint rise and fall of her sides, barely. Traffic hummed softly behind him, engines idling like a nervous chorus. He spoke without taking his eyes off the cats. "Everybody stay back," he said, voice low but firm. "We've been here before. Let's give her space." He took a few more steps forward. The bobcat's ears twitched, tracking his movement. She looked thinner now, dustier. Raising 4 young in this kind of country takes more than strength. It takes luck. And whatever luck she'd had was clearly wearing thin. Then came the moment that pulled this scene out of the realm of coincidence. The mother stood and walked over to the collapsed kitten. Very gently, she touched her nose to the little one's ear, as if checking one last time. Then she lifted her head and looked straight at Caleb, not around him, not at the vehicles, directly at him. You could stand there and call that instinct if you wanted to. You could say she was just reacting to the nearest movement, the largest shape. But to the people on that road, people who had watched her do some version of this once already, it felt like something else. Like a decision. She uttered a short, sharp chirp, the kind bobcats used to call their young. The 2 healthy kittens turned, scampering toward the ditch. And then, just like the first day, she did something that no training manual fully prepares you for. She stepped back. 1, 2, 3 careful paces, enough to clear a space around the fallen kitten, enough to make it obvious that she was neither attacking nor fleeing. The little female remained on the yellow line, alone in a strip of sunlight that suddenly felt much too bright. Caleb heard a man behind him whisper, "She's giving her to him." He didn't answer. His throat was too tight for that. He simply did what he had done before, moved slowly, knelt on the hot asphalt, and spread the blanket beside that fragile body. The kitten was colder than the first one had been, limp, no hiss, no twitch. For a second he thought they were too late. Then, as he slid a hand under her ribs, he felt the faintest flutter against his fingers. Not strong. Still there. "Easy, kid," he murmured. "We're not done yet." He wrapped her up and stood, backing away 1 step at a time. The mother bobcat held her ground at the edge of the lane. The 2 stronger kittens pressed around her legs. Once again, she did not bolt for the safety of the scrub until he had put a solid distance between them. Only when he reached the last truck and opened his cruiser door did she turn. She led her 2 healthy young off the road, slipping into the brush with that same low, fluid motion he'd watched 100 wild animals use, just never after a negotiation like this. What do you call that? On paper, it's a repeat wildlife incident, a traffic hazard. But for the people who stood on Highway 47 that morning, watching a wild bobcat use a human-made traffic jam as if it were a signal flare, it looked a lot like intelligence under pressure. We know from field studies that animals learn to use our structures. Hawks hunting along roadsides, foxes denning under sheds, coyotes timing their crossings. But here was a mother bobcat doing something more precise. inserting herself into our routines on purpose, blocking our schedule to force a response, and handing off the weakest of her kittens to the same uniform who'd carried the first one away. And for Caleb, it felt less like rescuing wildlife and more like answering a request. Back at Desert Ridge Wildlife Center, Dr. Elena met them at the door with that same focused calm. The second kitten was even lighter than the first. Blood sugar lower, chances slimmer. The room seemed to grow smaller as monitors beeped and numbers settled into place. While she worked, Caleb told her what had happened on the road. Her hands didn't pause, but her eyes did. "Twice," she said quietly. "Same place, same pattern." She glanced toward the incubator room. "That's not random, Caleb. She's using you, using the highway. She's thinking it through." For a moment, the line between us and them felt softer. Not gone, but blurred around the edges. We weren't just the threat in her landscape anymore. For this one bobcat, for this one hard season, we had become a tool in her survival kit. Out on Highway 47, the traffic had started to move again. People went back to their jobs, their errands, their appointments. But word of what happened worked its way through Red Mesa, in the grocery store, at the diner, across back fences. "Did you hear? That bobcat came back. Same officer, same deal." In the next part, we'll spend more time inside Desert Ridge, watching what it really takes to pull two bobcat kittens back from the edge and preparing them for a life where they'll never lean on humans again. If you've ever wondered how you help a wild animal and then step completely out of its story, stay with me. That's where we're headed next. By the time summer settled hard over Red Mesa, the two smallest bobcat kittens from Highway 47 didn't look small anymore. If you had only seen them in those first hours, limp on a stainless steel table, tubes and wires everywhere, you might not have believed they were the same animals now pacing the length of Desert Ridge's outdoor enclosure. Muscles rippling, tails flicking, eyes bright and sharp as new coins. Inside the center, someone had written their temporary names on the whiteboard in green marker: Mesa and Ridge. No nicknames, no cutesy hearts. Just simple names borrowed from the landscape they were meant to return to. The clear explanation of what happened over the next months is this. Desert Ridge did what small wildlife centers all over the United States quietly do every day. They gave two wild bobcats just enough help to survive, and then did everything in their power to make sure those bobcats never got comfortable with humans. It began in the incubator room. Warmth, fluids, careful, measured feedings. For a while, it was touch and go, and no one pretended otherwise. There were nights when Elena checked on them every hour, watching their breathing, adjusting the drip of a line no wider than a piece of thread. Then it was a short, sharp hiss, tiny teeth bared at a hand that had done nothing but save his life. "That's it," Elena said with a tired smile. "That's what we want." Hissing meant strength. It meant wildness stepping back into the space where weakness had been. It meant they were no longer too empty to protest. After that, watching them through the glass, Caleb saw two damp little bundles slowly stretch into the shape of bobcats again. Shoulders rising, legs steadying, tails beginning that slow, deliberate sway that says, "I'm aware of everything." Education wove through this process in quiet ways. A volunteer pointed out how their markings darkened as they grew, spots turning from faint gray smudges to clear black rosettes. Elena explained that bobcats like these help keep rodent populations under control, which means fewer mice in grain stores, fewer rats near homes. Out in the desert, these cats weren't decorations. They were maintenance crews. When the pair finally moved into the big outdoor enclosure, the work shifted from survival to preparation. Staff stopped hand-feeding. Instead, they hid food in tufts of grass, under logs, tucked between rocks. Mesa and Ridge had to use their noses, their ears, their patience. They learned to stalk dead mice as if they were alive. They learned to climb and leap and drop without sound. Sometimes, standing at the observation window, Caleb would catch himself wanting to tap the glass, to say something, to announce his presence. He never did. The few times the young bobcats noticed him, they drew back, ears flat, eyes narrow. That was exactly how it should be. Inside town, the story of the bobcat kittens grew right alongside them. The local paper ran a short column, "Highway 47 bobcats recovering at Desert Ridge." A grainy photo of two spotted shapes behind mesh made the front of the community section. At the diner, people circled the picture with coffee-stained fingers. "That's them," the trucker said, pointing. "Same ones from the road. I swear that mother stared right through me." At the hardware store, a clerk taped a donation jar near the register with a simple sign, "For Mesa, Ridge, and the next ones who need it." People dropped in loose bills and the change they used to forget on the counter. Red Mesa was still Red Mesa. Folks had their own problems, their own families to care for. But something had shifted. When drivers spotted a bobcat crossing a back road at dusk now, they didn't just see a hazard. They saw a neighbor trying to get home. Elena used the attention gently. In one interview on the local radio, she walked listeners through what to do if they saw wildlife on the road. Bobcats, deer, anything. Slow down. Give the animal room. Avoid honking or crowding it with your car. Stay inside your vehicle unless you're in immediate danger. Call it in. Let trained responders make the decisions. Simple actions, small courtesies that, taken together across a county, can save a lot of pause from a lot of yellow lines. For Caleb, these months were a kind of quiet schooling. He came by the center when he could, always staying behind the glass, always keeping his hands to himself. He watched Mesa and Ridge tackle each other in clouds of dust, stalk the rustle of a hidden quail, explode up a log with their claws digging in like hooks. The bobcat kittens he had once carried like fragile bundles had become something he wouldn't dare pick up now. There was a complicated comfort in that. He'd spent his whole career focused on presence, being on scene, making the call, writing the report. Now he was seeing the power of stepping back, of helping just enough, and then letting the wild reclaim what was always its own. Every so often, he'd catch Elena looking at the same scene through the glass, her arms folded, expression unreadable. "Tough part," she said once, without taking her eyes off the cats, "is knowing we'll never really know what happens to them after release. We send them out, we hope, we trust the work, and that's it." He nodded. In his world, you usually got closure. A verdict, a signed form, a finished case. Here, success meant never seeing them again. In a town like Red Mesa, where the desert wraps right up against backyards, that perspective began to seep into everyday life. People who once saw the landscape as empty started to talk about it as occupied. By bobcats, by owls, by foxes, whose routines were just as important as human schedules. Highway 47 itself started to feel different too. Not softer. It was still a hard strip of asphalt where bad things could happen fast, but more like shared ground than human property. As summer began to lean toward fall, the notes on Desert Ridge's whiteboard changed. The weights next to Mesa and Ridge's names climbed steadily. A small checkmark appeared next to the word hunting. Then another next to avoids people. One afternoon, Caleb glanced up and saw a new word beside both names. Release. That's the point where all the hard work turns into a goodbye. In the final part of this story, we'll travel with them back toward the land that first nearly took their lives and see what happens when two grown bobcats step out of a crate. The highway hums in the distance, and an old officer has to open the door and let them disappear. If you've walked with us this far, stay with me a little longer. The way this chapter ends has a quiet power all its own. On the day they opened the crates, the light over Red Mesa didn't feel like the same light that had glared down on Highway 47 all those months before. Back then, the sun had been harsh and unforgiving, glaring off the asphalt as a bobcat family stood on the yellow line. Today, it was softer. Late afternoon, almost evening. The kind of light that lays gently across the land and makes even a stretch of desert feel like it's holding its breath. The release site wasn't on the road itself, but you could still hear Highway 47 in the distance, a low, constant hum behind the breeze. Desert Ridge's old pickup eased off onto a rough track and stopped in a shallow wash lined with juniper and scrub. This was bobcat country again. Not human country, with a bobcat passing through. When the truck doors shut, the quiet folded back over them. The explanation for why they came here, to this exact place, is simple and deep at the same time. Mesa and Ridge had been born in this piece of land. Their paws first touched the world just beyond that thin tree line that runs along the highway. Bobcats are territorial, tied to scent and landmark and hidden paths that weave through brush and rock. Releasing them here gave them the best chance to step back into a story that had been interrupted, not erased. Caleb knew that. Elena knew it. They'd both agreed. If these bobcats were going to reclaim their wild lives, it should be as close as possible to where their mother once stood her ground. They unloaded the 2 transport crates and carried them a short distance from the truck, deeper into the wash where the hum of engines faded to a faint murmur. The crates shook slightly with each breath the bobcats took inside, soft thuds of muscle against plastic. This wasn't like carrying them into Desert Ridge that first time, limp and nearly weightless. These animals were solid now. Strong, all tension and coiled potential under spotted fur. Caleb set his crate down and just stood there for a moment, one hand resting lightly on the top. No speeches, no big declarations, just a man taking one last quiet inventory of what this journey had asked of him. He thought about the first time he'd seen a bobcat on Highway 47, the mother planted on the yellow line, 4 tiny shapes at her feet, traffic frozen in a way no patrol manual had ever described. He thought about the feel of those kittens in his arms, dry fur and fragile ribs and that stubborn little hiss. He thought about the long months of driving past that mile marker and seeing more than just a strip of road. "You two have work to do," he said under his breath, almost more to himself than to them. Elena gave him a small nod. "When we open them," she reminded gently, "we step back. No calling, no clapping. If this goes the way it should, they'll forget about us the second those doors swing." He knew that too. The whole point of Desert Ridge, of this entire rescue, was to heal just enough so that forgetting humans became possible again. That's the paradox of places like this. Success looks like vanishing. He crouched and unlatched the first crate. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Mesa slipped out, low to the ground, each paw placed with that careful bobcat precision. He paused, nose lifted, taking the desert air in as if tasting it. His coat caught the last light in shades of tawny gold and charcoal. He didn't look back at the truck, or the humans, or the road. He looked at the trees. Ridge followed faster, lighter, tail tip twitching. She hopped over a fallen branch as if she'd been practicing that exact move in the enclosure for this moment. The 2 of them stood side by side for a few seconds, shoulders brushing, bodies angled toward the deeper brush. And then the story did something that no one at Desert Ridge could have planned. From the shadow beneath a dense juniper, an older bobcat stepped into view. Her coat was rougher, her muscles leaner from another hard year in the desert. There was no dramatic music, no slow-motion reunion, just 3 bobcats in a wash at sunset, all of them very still. Mesa and Ridge froze, then gave a low chuff, a sound that was more question than greeting. The older bobcat didn't rush to them, didn't drive them away. She turned her head slightly, body angled toward a narrow game trail leading up out of the wash. An invitation, or at least an allowance, a small, wild gesture that said, "This way." For Caleb, standing a good distance back beside the empty crates, the moment felt larger than the scene in front of him. Months ago, their mother had stepped onto Highway 47 and used human traffic like a tool, blocking cars and handing over her weakest kittens across that yellow line. Today, on her own ground, the wild was reclaiming them without a word from anyone wearing a badge or a stethoscope. The 3 bobcats slipped into the brush one after another, spots blending with shadow, tails disappearing behind rock and branch until there was nothing left to see. No triumphant look over the shoulder, No last pose for the people who had worked so hard. Just absence. The wash felt bigger without them somehow, quieter and more complete at the same time. The road in the distance kept humming, as it always had. The difference now was inside the people who heard it. For some in Red Mesa, Highway 47 would never again be just a way to get to work. It would also be the place where a bobcat mother forced them to stop long enough to see that the desert was not empty, and that our human lines and schedules are laid over someone else's home. For Caleb, it marked a bend in his own life, a reminder that even after decades on the job, there was still room to answer a new kind of call, to protect something that would never know his name. Maybe as you listen to this, there's a road in your own life that you've driven so many times, you've stopped really seeing it. A routine that feels worn smooth, a part of you that used to care deeply about something wild or tender, and somehow got pushed to the edges. Stories like this one don't fix everything, but they can nudge us to look again, to notice the quiet lives moving alongside ours, to remember that sometimes our role is not to control, but to step in gently, help for a season, and then let go. If this bobcat family's journey touched something in you, if it made you breathe a little slower or see your own stretch of road a little differently, I'd invite you to sit with that for a moment after this video ends. Ask yourself where, in your own world, you might be called to guard something small and wild, even if it never says thank you. And if you'd like to walk with us through more stories like this, of bobcats and other wild neighbors finding their way back from the edge, I'd be grateful if you'd tap like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. Finally, if your heart is pulling you to do just a bit more, you can use the Super Thanks button or check the links below to support the kind of rescue work that gave Mesa, Ridge, and so many other wild animals another chance. Your kindness helps turn busy roads and hard seasons into stories of healing.